So yes, as I've said, thank you very much for attending Zwischen Workshop 2, Vada, with me, Stephen Allen, and Connor Shields. Connor Shields is an artist based in Leeds. His work draws upon the tensions between working class masculinity through an exploration of materials. And we're here today in order to discuss a variety of themes to do with living in plain sight and of conventions of masculinity and an exploration of queer identities and of the degenerate as a sort of word that was used in a variety of contexts throughout these people's lives. And it's at this point that I'd like to sort of talk about how me and Connor sort of got to know each other. I started off, in fact, what am I saying? I best share the screen, haven't I, in order to begin this. Sorry about that, everyone. Let's start the presentation, shall we? That'd be good. There we go. Right, there we go. Can everybody see that? If everybody can sort of wave their face or raise their hands so that I can let people know that they can see this. Yeah. That'd be a benefit. Yeah, that's grand. But yeah, myself and Connor, I began first meeting up with Connor when Connor was a artist in residence and winner of the graduate award with Yorkshire Sculpture Park in 2018. And I happened upon his work as at the exhibition that he did in the boathouse at Yorkshire Sculpture Park. Really sort of striking pieces of work about the exploration of masculinity and femininity, the juxtaposition of materials. And I sort of created this narrative arc behind the materials of sort of creating this every person, and sort of the identity of this sort of archetypal person, and just really sort of connected with regards to the exploration of queer identity. And it's through that we've sort of had this continued conversation. And Connor, if you'd like to sort of elaborate on the sort of inspiration for your practice and the materials that you use.
Yeah, so you mentioned a bit about my practice and sort of the ideas around sort of working class masculinity and sort of material language and the perceptions that we do have of the materials. And yeah, so that's sort of like a brief overview of that. So there's a lot of sort of knitting, which is sort of like I look at the sort of the stereotypes that come with the objects and sort of the conversation when you put the two together. But yeah, so I was doing a little show at Yorkshire Sculpture Park in 2000, and actually it was 19.
Apologies in that regard.
No, it's that I did that in the 18, but then in 19 I did the show, and I sort of saw your queer art blog, and I was sort of thinking, I was quite new to the art scene at the time, and I didn't really, nobody really wrote about my work, and I was thinking, okay, well, who do I feel like I would like to write about my work? And I saw your blog, and I thought, actually, you know, sort of a queer art writing blog would be very fitting for the work. So I got in touch with you, and then you came to the park, and got a little preview before it had opened, and you wrote an article, and then from then we've worked together a little bit since, and obviously been working on this for the past month or so.
Yeah, it's been there's been a lot of sort of continued works there. Oh.
Yeah. Did you see Janet's comment?
Oh,
she said she was thinking of doing it. See if it worked.
So what happened was, so I sort of got the idea for this workshop when a different one of these sessions, when you're talking about the Bauhaus and how the Nazis sort of started to put a stop to this movement and started to control certain arts that they didn't think maybe aligned with the Nazi values, and the Bauhaus was one of them. And it sort of made me think about Philip Johnson and his one particular structure in particular, which was the glass house, because I know he was a homosexual man, but also the sort of the paradox of him being also a Nazi, and then they're two different things that sort of don't really align. Like, I'd never heard of that before, so that's where the sort of the idea come from, thinking about the Bauhaus. So I'll give a little bit of background on Philip Johnson first. So he was born in 1906 in Cleveland, Ohio, and he was born to quite a wealthy family. His dad was quite a wealthy lawyer, and I think this is important to note, and I'll touch on it a little bit more later, that he sort of came from a position of privilege because of wealth. So he attended many private schools in his life. The last one was Hackley, which is in New York, and Hackley had an arrangement which then the students could get into Harvard, sort of without any questions asked. And he had quite historically bad grades. So, but again, because of where he was and his position, he was able to then go to one of the best schools in the world. And he wasn't openly gay, but he was. Sorry, I'll just let me. He wasn't openly gay, but until 1993, but his he will have been out in his close circles, and his dad in particular wasn't accepting of him, and his dad told him that, quote, "Boys don't fall in love with boys." So yeah, I think although he was a gay man, and he sort of had a different privilege to that potentially other people at the time would have had. And then onto sort of the subject of his fascism, again, that sort of the juxtaposition between fascist and homosexual. Usually, I find that well, this is just my opinion, but I find that people who are queer tend to be quite left-wing. I find that left-wing politics, I mean, it's sort of a general statement, tends to sort of favour queer people over right-wing, and fascism in particular. But then there's sort of this idea of whether him being mixed in with these fascist circles was to do with him, like was that his way of hiding in plain sight? Because that's what the workshop's about. Anyway, so he visited Berlin, and he attended a Hitler rally, and he described the experience as totally febrile, which is sort of nervous excitement. It was sort of in the final stages of the fascist takeover of the Weimar Republic. And he sort of corresponded also with an anti-Semitic newspaper called The Social Justice, and described that it was more than a passing admiration for Hitler that he had. And he also described Hitler as better than Roosevelt, who was also the sort of the leader of America at the time. And later in life, he tried to deny his Nazi involvement, and even though he attended lots of American Nazi parties, and some of them being at Madison Square Garden, but he tried to sort of blame it on his homosexuality and described his involvement within it as purely sexual, and he was quoted being thrilled by all the blonde boys in black leather. So he tried to play that off, which again is another quite messed up thing. Try to describe your Nazism as purely sexual.
Yeah, there was this idea of fetishizing the sort of Nazi ideals was something that really sort of sat uneasily with me. The way in which he sort of sought to, we're talking about hiding in plain sight.
Mhm.
This idea that he was sort of a gay person. It seemed that, as you were saying, with regards to the relationship with his father, it seems to me that the way which he was choosing to hide was to find an ideology that was the antithesis of those feelings. The idea of being sort of fascist, sort of hyper masculine, sort of leather, sort of military ideals were sort of counter to what he was actually feeling as a homosexual person. And I think that it, from a just as an idea that sort of popped into my mind, is that it was sort of to appease the feelings that he had of shame for against what his father had told him, that he was actually seeking to be more masculine because of what his father had said.
Potentially. Also, I think a lot of his background in the sort of the fascism comes because one thing was about the school Huxley. Apparently, they sort of favoured that all of the staff and the students came from the right Anglo-Saxon background, which again, and also coming from this position of privilege and sort of this idea of thinking that one person is better than other or is in a high position in a hierarchy. I feel like these all subtly point to his fascism, or his sort of sympathy towards the Nazis and sort of his liking to the Nazi ideals.
So yeah, does anybody else have any views on that as a sort of discussion point? Opening it up to the group.
If not, we can discuss it in a bit more.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Johnson was also in these positions, and mixing with, I want to say, like the right sort of the important people within the art world was. Yeah, I agree, Sarah. Yeah, there was a lot of important people that he was mixing with, and one of them was Alfred Barr, who was just being appointed director of what was to be the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he offered Johnson a job if he were to learn more about modernism, and which sort of led to him, if we go on to the next part, about the glass house. So the glass house is the sort of the main thing that I got this idea for, and it was built in 1949. It's situated on Johnson's estate in Connecticut, and it was actually influenced by Farnsworth House, which is by Mies van der Rohe, which Steve will talk about in a little while. And in 1947, he curated a show at MoMA, which featured a model of the building that was by Mies van der Rohe, which influenced this. But so the space is actually 56 by 32 for rectangular structure. And these are all sort of like the specifics of the space, but what I'm more sort of interested in is the sort of the homosexual, like the sort of homosexual subtext that there is to the building, and the sort of like queer analysis of it. So the building as itself, I find that a lot of Johnson's architecture is generally not too interesting, but this one, I find it interesting from sort of a conceptual point of view. And the ideas of sort of, you are living your life in this house and people can see in, you've sort of got this protection from like this sheer barrier of glass, yet people are sort of gazing into the space, and there's sort of like an idea about voyeurism, and even beyond voyeurism, sort of exhibitionism, that you are in a position where you're being watched. And also,
yeah,
like the bedroom, being like a sort of a very personal space, even sort of linked to like family life, to have that on display. Yeah, sorry, Steve.
No, it's all right. I completely agree with what you were saying. There, as you mentioned, I shall be talking about the Farnsworth House. As far as the Glass House is concerned, there are definite architectural links between the Bauhaus movement, of which Mies van der Rohe was one of the leaders of in the latter stages when it moved back to Berlin, and modernism, which Mies van der Rohe was one of the proponents of when he left the Bauhaus. This form is very, as we'll go on to discuss, I would say of the two, I much prefer Farnsworth House. Now, this may be me being biased, and I entirely accept that. But for me, I think that speaking in terms of just an architectural form, I prefer Farnsworth House. Speaking in terms of the subtext and the sort of queering of the space, the Glass House is a much more realized structure.
Yeah, I like, Sarah, that you've noticed that it is Mies's furniture. So the structure itself is not Bauhaus, even though this is about the Bauhaus, but there's definite Bauhaus influence from it, and also the furniture inside of the house. Like there was lots of art collected from the Bauhaus, and again the furniture and sort of Mies being part of the Bauhaus. I think, you know, there's definitely a link there because this was influenced by the piece from Mies.
Yeah, you can clearly see here the Barcelona chairs in this photo here, and again there was definite sort of inspiration from Mies van der Rohe and Farnsworth House. Yes, I wasn't going to say rip off because again I am biased, but again I think the other thing that I'll come on to is there's a definite contrast between the form and where it sits upon the land and how it sits upon the land. And if we move on to the next slide, we'll have a discussion with regards to Farnsworth House.
There's also a contrast in the last one between, because there was an outhouse which was completely brick but with no windows. So I think, and that was a lot I was reading just before this, where a lot of the sort of, he would entertain male guests and sort of his partner, and it was sort of this idea of like, when in a time when it wasn't publicly accepted or even legal to be gay, it's like you were orchestrating, you were living in plain sight within this space. And also there was sort of, if any sexual activity were to happen, it would happen in the space that was closed off. So it would happen behind closed doors. And I see it as sort of like a metaphor for like the closet even.
Yeah, it's definitely, he's sort of orchestrating the parts of his life that he wants the public to see. And we discussed the idea that he's hiding through an idea of absolute candor. He's displaying the parts that he thinks that people want to see, whereas actually the truth of himself is hidden. And I think that that's sort of the way in which society was.
Yeah.
And yes, I think that there's definitely, it's really interesting, Sarah, that you say that with regards to the idea of flaunting his privilege and this idea of arrogance. I came to the same conclusion, that the arrogance is seen actually in the architecture. If you look at Mies van der Rohe's Farnsworth House in these images, I think that the fact that there's such lightness of touch upon the land, and the fact that the form is, you can see through it, you can see around it. The fact that it is the sort of way in which it's all one color, even the fact that the steps in this one sort of, it seems to be an incredibly gentle way in order to approach. Even the fact that there's such a sort of shallow gate or step in order to reach up. It seems to be, even though it is a step, the accessible, open, free of clutter. It seems to be much more free, whereas in the previous in the glass house, it seems to be an assertion of dominance upon the land. It seems to be, I'm here, I want a glass house, I want it to be my manifestation of my creation, and the land is basically, I will frame the view to suit my need. Whereas Mies, in my opinion, has thought about leaving as small a footprint as possible.
I also feel like the Mies one, it just seems more thought out, and it took longer to make, which is probably for that reason. But there's a lightness to it that and not talking about the obvious and the colour, but in terms of the structure of it and the feel of it, it doesn't feel like it interrupts the space as much as the Johnson one does. You can sort of see, you can see under it, you can see through it. It just seems like it's not just placed on the ground, it's being more considered.
Yes, and the other thing is that this central structure, which you can see here, is modular. So each of these sort of wardrobes and cupboards would move up and down in order to allow for the space to be completely remodeled and redesigned. So if you can see in this sort of section here, the cupboards are sort of completely shut away in order to allow for the space to be completely remodeled for sort of dining as opposed to sleeping and recreation. So it's a completely user-friendly, to use a sort of relatively glib term, but the space suits the person that's living within it, rather than a person insisting upon the space, which all good architecture, I would argue, does. It's about the space working with the person rather than the person forcing the space to do what it needs.
We've got a couple of comments as well.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's have a look at this. So I was going to say that the fact that Johnson's one is indirect, abrupt contact with the ground exemplifies what you've just said. The Mies one has the courtesy to just perch there. I love that description. It just perches, which yeah, I think that's great. So yes, flaunting privilege, but perhaps refusing erasure by bodies being visible and taking up space visually as part of the performative nature of his architecture. It's camp.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying in terms of like queer people taking up space. I just think because of his privilege and everything, I feel like he's not the right person to, and I don't know if I'm right saying it doesn't feel like the right person to be taking up space, and I feel like something about it would feel obnoxious for that purpose. And actually, I do think he was sort of taking up space, and it was mentioned earlier that he was sort of like, Mies is making this, and I've seen what he's doing. I'm going to make it first, and the sort of, yeah, there's something that feels obnoxious about it. But I do agree in terms of it does take up space, and if that's the intention, if that's the purpose, then Johnson's achieved it.
Mm-hmm.
But for
yes, it is this idea of camp, which I think is, can it be camp if it's intended to be a space of voyeurism? If there is intention behind it, then I'm not sure whether it can be deemed as camp. What do other people think?
Yeah, that's good. I would like to hear what people think about camp. Another subject wasn't discussed, but I would like to hear. I'm not too sure, George, if the Mies one was built on land they owned. Do you know anything about that?
That I haven't actually looked into that. I know that the glass house, the land was owned by Johnson. It isn't something that I've looked into with regards to the Farnsworth House. I wasn't sure whether it was commissioned by, because it's built in Chicago, I believe.
Chicago.
I think
Illinois.
It was built in Illinois, just outside. I think it was just outside of Chicago. I believe that it was commissioned by. He was commissioned to build it, so I don't think that Mies owned the land. But do not quote me on that. It will require further research. And the other thing to mention at this stage is that if people are interested in the sources of our research, I shall make them available at the end of the workshop, and I'll email people the sources of our research if they are interested. They can make themselves known at the end. So that feels sort of significant as a difference. Yes, I think that you're correct in that with regards to that distinction with regards to whether the land is theirs, and it would raise a distinction with regards to how they treat the land with regards to ownership. Yeah, that's a good argument. Yeah. But yeah, I think from there it's it'd be good to sort of, unless anybody has any points with regards to the comparisons, or at that point, which one do they prefer with regards to the Farnsworth House or the glass house? I have my opinions, and as I've said, I am biased with regards to that. But
I mean,
what do other people think?
I know I was critical of the glass house in terms of it being potentially, and Johnson himself did say, has never denied that it was taking influence from that. But actually, as a structure, I think conceptually I really like it. Whether he was, that self-aware enough to make a piece of architecture which actually intended to say that, but I think it I don't know whether with him being a queer person anyway, or a gay person, whether it just subconsciously the meaning was put onto it because of him, whether if it was anybody else making it, it would have that. But yeah, that's just my thoughts on that.
Yeah. So it's from there that we move on to Max Peifer Watenphul, who was a contemporary of the Bauhaus, along with Mies van der Rohe. He joined the Bauhaus. Well, I suppose I'd better talk about why I wanted to discuss Max. He himself was a gay man. He didn't actually come out per se, but he was known to be homosexual to people within the Bauhaus. Similar to Philip Johnson, really. He didn't formally come out but until much later in his life, but he was known to have male lovers, even within the Bauhaus. Or he was known to have sort of very special friends, I think was the wording that was used by his sister. He joined the Bauhaus in 1919 on the insistence of Lily Clay, who was Paul Clay's wife, and she recognized the talent that he had for watercolor, as well as, and at that time he was described as the lyrical poet of painting. He had an incredible eye for form and for color, and for he would always go around with sketchbook watercolors, and had this sort of eidetic memory for sort of remembrances of form. He would quickly sort of sketch them down and relay them onto paper, take them away, and was sort of fanatical about realizing form. He then, from there, he joined the movement of Johannes Itten and was sort of prolific in realizing Johannes Itten's idea of color and form as being a universal language. He was an incredibly poor person at the time, and he lived on patronage of other people, and it's this that I wanted to discuss as sort of a contrast to Philip Johnson. They were sort of active at, I'd say, relatively the same time. Would you say, Connor, with regards to their sort of activity?
Yeah,
sort of 1920s, 30s,
early 20th century.
Yeah, and the idea that they put two sort of homosexual men, sort of relying from very, very different classes, seeking different means to sort of hide their homosexuality. For Max, within the Bauhaus, he was relying on finding a group of peers and also relying on patronage and with regards to his work. It's at this stage that he sort of went on to describe the Bauhaus as being sort of this cult-like following. He described the students as painting their shoes a different color every day just to bring sort of an element of whimsy to what it is that they were doing. They sort of stayed in sort of unheated studios. They would eat sort of onion seeds. They would wrap themselves in linens and sort of flay their skin in order to experience the sort of pleasure and the pain of the activity that they were doing. And in this quote that he wrote towards the latter parts of his life for a biography, this sort of goes on to explain a sort of contemporary view of the Bauhaus in Weimar in 1920. So in the summer, there were impressive lantern festivals, and we bathed nude in the Ilm by moonlight, which is the river that runs through Weimar. These were harmless romantic pleasures, but the citizens of Weimar regarded them as the vastly mad debauches of the already notorious and infamous people of the Bauhaus. We found the evening events inspiring, diverting, and sometimes thrilling. So to me, it seems that, again, for the outsiders looking into the Bauhaus, we're seeing it as this sort of mad, depraved, debauched hootenanny of people who were mad as badgers, when to Max it was a group of like-minded people, and that it was an unconventional safe space, which to me, that's what I would hope that Zwischen is. And of all of the people within the Bauhaus, Max is the person that I identify with the most, because it's in these unconventional safe spaces that we can have a broad conversation about safety and space and feeling empowered as queer people to broaden that message of inclusivity. And it's interesting to see how these people back then navigated living in plain sight. So it's, and the reasons that I brought him into this section of the workshop is to provide a contrast, but also a feeling of familiarity, because regardless of how you hide, it's that need for a communal feeling. I think that with Philip, he was creating his own, as I said, an orchestrated view. He had the outside image that people would see in the glass house, but also he created a community that other people wouldn't see with the guest house. For Max, he had the people that followed Itten in the Bauhaus. Unfortunately, once the Bauhaus closed down and was shut down, well, firstly, he left in 1923 once Johannes Itten was ejected from the Bauhaus after falling out with Walter Gropius. He, for a long time thereafter, followed various rich patrons around Europe and Central and South America. It was a case of this yearning to find acceptance through the charity of others. And I think that that's the feeling that a lot of people can identify with even today, this need for a community. And I think that that's what do other people think of that? The sort of comparison between the two figures here. What do you think, Connor?
I think, well, my sort of interest in the comparison is, I'm also thinking of this position of how Johnson would have hidden in comparison to Max. And like you're saying, you sort of touched on this, but I think Max mixing within a sea of creative people, typically they may have been more accepting of queer people in the Bauhaus. Whereas and also to do with positions of status or power that they had, and with sort of Johnson being a millionaire and sort of feeling like he had a lot of protection because of his status and his wealth, whereas Max was the complete opposite, and Max was poor, and he had he will have had a different set of challenges, and they will have both had challenges being homosexual at the time. But I think, yeah, that contrast about, and again, I want to talk a little bit about polarity after this, and in terms of thinking as well as, would polarity have been something that Max might have needed to use as opposed to Johnson, or would Johnson have already wanted to use it? I think we've got a message from Sarah.
Yeah, in relation to yes, just like fine young things, they're just being young and free. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that that's the message that Max was trying to put across. Max actually died in 1976, so this was relatively close towards the end of his life, and I think that this was sort of a reflective view upon his time at the Bauhaus as one of being this sort of looking back and reflecting upon those times as sort of hedonistic youth. And I think that that's the view that I got from this. Someone, and yeah, I think that we all have that sort of, sometimes we do look at it through rose-tinted glasses, the view of our youth, but I don't think that that makes it any less sort of keen. The senses, the smells, the tastes. I think that we may imagine them as sort of a little bit more visceral than perhaps they were, but that doesn't detract from the feelings that we had. It doesn't lessen them. I think that I read this and I actually see this as being the truth or his truth. And yeah, as we were saying, he left. So Max left the Bauhaus in 1923. From there, he travelled to Hittingen and met, and it was at that point that he developed his practice into photography. He didn't really, or wasn't really interested in photography at the Bauhaus, which is a little surprising given the number of photographers that came out of the Bauhaus. But he didn't actually take it up until much later, and only sort of developed it as a way of exploring gender roles in sort of the late 20s and early 30s. And in this next slide, you'll see that he used photography in order to explore this idea of camp. I would say this motif here is one that's relatively common in art history, the idea of the woman with fan, going back, I'd say, to the sort of 17th century. But here we see this motif juxtaposed with sort of a man in drag, sort of changing and subverting this ideal. And here we have these other images sort of weaponizing, I would argue, this idea of high femininity and the sort of ostentatiousness of the images, the sort of floral motifs, the sort of heavy and heady use of makeup, the ornamentation, the sort of jewelry. I think that it is this sort of idea of place and sexualization within the media, but also of it's all of these images are sort of staring out at you. They're a sort of direct, with the exception of this woman in fan, but they are sort of looking into the camera as a sort of conversation to be had with the viewer about where we are as a nation, as a people, looking upon them. What do you think, Connor? And opening this up to everyone.
Yeah, I think what is interesting, I find interesting about this is where these works came to be. In terms of, if you want to talk a little bit more about. Oh
yes, certainly. In towards the later part of the later part of the Weimar Republic, 1936 was also coincided with the rise of National Socialism. Max's pieces, including his watercolors, his paintings, his photography, was designated as degenerate art. So these pieces ended up in a display of degenerate art in Berlin in 1936. They, after that, were thought destroyed because a great many of his pieces were destroyed in a fire at his studio in Krefeld in 1941. It only came to light that actually these pieces were actually purchased by a Nazi businessman, Kurt Kirchbach, and were actually put up for auction in a sale in 1990. So it's interesting in that, again, degenerate art, this idea of art being, certain art forms being deemed sort of sensational and not worthy of public view, were actually inspired, or people were inspired or compelled to save them, to view them, to admire them.
It sort of makes me wonder about the person whose collection it came to be part of, because obviously the Nazis deemed that this was not acceptable art, or it was not art. They tried to sort of, police what art should be available and should be viewed, and these did not meet that category. And also for somebody who was a Nazi to then actually have these interests in the work, which was sort of countered their views or countered their political views, it sort of makes me wonder what they were like as a person, but there's potentially no way of knowing.
That's the thing. The other thing is that Georg Mucha and Joseph Albers owned two of these grotesques, as well as a great many of them turning up in Kurt Kirchbach's collection. So in order to prevent them being designated degenerate art, Max gave two of them to Joseph Albers and three of them to sorry, who was I saying? Anyway, apologies. But he gifted a number of them to people, and we know for a fact that Joseph Albers owned two of them. But again, the rest of them, or a great many of them, ended up in the collection of Kurt Kirchbach, which is fascinating in terms of the subversion and the idea of the degenerate, which we'll go on to a little bit later on.
Yeah.
But yes, this brings us on to the idea of the language that was used, and as we were mentioning, hiding in plain sight, and the different and myriad means of doing that. Oh,
yeah. So thinking about this idea of Johnson's glass house and living in plain sight, it sort of did make me think of Polari. So I'll talk a little bit about, I think some of you will already know what Polari is, but so it's a centuries-old cant and sort of back slang. It was used predominantly by gay men and lesbian women across London and other UK cities, although it was not exclusively just a gay language. And it's sort of traced back, it was used a lot through sort of the 19th century and the early 20th century, but it even dates back to sort of the 16th century. So it the actual structure of it, it's a sort of mixture of Italian, Romani, London slang, and then some back slang, and also contains some Yiddish words as well, which is sort of Central Eastern. I never know what it is, the Jewish, is it
Ashkenazi.
And it was sort of a means to be able to communicate in times when it was illegal to be gay. So, and also for homosexuals to disguise themselves from hostile outsiders and undercover policemen when it was illegal, like I said. It was also popularized in the 60s by a BBC comedy radio show called Round the Horn. That's where it sort of became to be most noticeable. And the show showcased two unapologetically camp queens, and Polaria's language acted as like a sophisticated way that would allow them to make jokes which were high in gay content, but able to get past the censors. But also at the same time, the jokes were simple enough so that listeners were able to understand it and understand exactly what it meant. Yeah, and it was possibly like one of the only, although the two characters were not openly gay, they used a lot of sort of characteristics and stereotypes, and it was potentially like the only acceptable or accessible even gay identities at the time in the 60s. And the sort of the sketches, if you can probably find some on YouTube, I think. The sort of features a lot of innuendos and sort of double meanings. One of them, for an example, what I've got was to do with when they were talking about politics, they would respond with something like, shake hands with your prospective member. So that sort of double meaning with that. And then, like I said, it was illegal to be gay at the time, pretty much. And it sort of added that extra mystery to it. And although apparently nobody was really shocked by it at the time, but I find that hard to believe. But the phrase here is sort of a little introduction of like how Polari would have been used. So this Bona to Vada your dolly eek. Bona was, or is it Bona? I'm not too sure which one it is, but it was translation for good. And did that actually come from Italian, Steve?
Yeah, well, buona is Italian, so I would guess that it's sort of a mangling or a sort of slight misappropriation of that.
And then Vada is to look, which is what we named the workshop after, this idea of living in plain sight and sort of looking. And dolly is sort of for attractive, and eek is face. It's sort of abbreviated from ECAF, which is space but spelt backwards. And then it's just like the first syllable of that. So Bona to Vada your dolly eek is good to look at your attractive face. And it would, like, if somebody heard somebody talking like that in the street, they might just sort of think past it, and they wouldn't really they wouldn't think much of it. And then I've got some other examples just to sort of share in terms of the structure of some words. So Hampsteads would be your teeth, because it would be Hampstead Heath, and then teeth and heath, the sort of the rhyme between them. Minces are your eyes, thinking mince pies, eyes, pies. And rare, is hair, because it's spelled backwards, and that sort of idea of backline. And then, there's also other ones to do with there's a lot of words for homosexual in the sort of Polari language, but each word relates to a different subcategory concerned with sort of sexual ability, masculinity, effeminacy, attractiveness, age, and sexual preference. So anti would be an older gay man, queen is sort of a general phrase, and then Nelly is an effeminate gay man. So there's a lot of different words for a lot of different things, and then each come from sort of different areas, like we talked about. Could be like of Italian influence.
And one of the things that we discussed was the use of Polari and the sort of the fact that it's a language of safety, but also of empowerment, and the fact that between Philip Johnson and Max Peifer Watenphul, who was the most likely to have used it or to have needed it, given the sort of positions of privilege and class and levels of sort of monetary, the sort of levels of money that each of them would have had at the times that they were around. And I came to the conclusion that it's much more likely that Max would have come into contact with it and also to have used it. But yeah, I think that's the conclusion that I came up with. Also, the fact that that Max, through his travels in Europe, he definitely travelled to Sicily, to Rome. The ideas that there would have been a sort of closer ideals, he'd have been closer to Italy.
Yeah,
it's not a million miles away.
I think it was predominantly used in sort of British, but he
right.
will have had a grasp of the language, and maybe that sort of might have aided. But yeah, I do think that it would have been more essential to somebody like Max to use it than Philip, because of all the reasons I've talked about thus far.
Yeah, and then the other question that I'd like to open up to people here is, this sort of demonstrates this idea of code switching and of having specific languages or mannerisms or types of behavior that you use in certain situations. And we read, or I read, Polari as being a language of empowerment, as I've mentioned. Being a queer, non-binary person, I'm aware of the fact that that's my interpretation, and I'm just curious as to whether that is felt by other people of other genders, sexualities. I'd just be interested to hear or to read other people's views on one, code switching, what they do, if they're comfortable to discuss that, and two, what their views are on Polari.
I've heard, I was pointed in the direction, Garth, of Jez Dolan. Jez Dolan's a Manchester-based artist. Yeah, and again, Garth has put a link to Jez's website, which is jezdolan.com. I will check that out.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Even put that in like a link with all of the other documents and whatnot.
Yeah, along with the information that we share out to people, should they be interested in hearing more, we'll certainly include that. Thank you very much, Kath.
I was interested to know if there's still, well, if anything like Polari is still used, and whether there's still a place these days for obscurantist language that can be understood by people who are in the know, but inexplicable to outsiders.
Yeah, there actually is. So there's a, I can't remember the name of it, but again, we could provide it in a document. But there is a form of, like sort of a parallel to Polari in South Africa. And it's used a lot in the present day as well. It's like a gay subculture thing that's used, and it differs from the English Polari that we've talked about here. But it is interesting, and it's used a lot in, there's a particular singer / artist that wrote a song, and it was a lot of it had sort of Polari references in it, and I think particularly South Africa, from my perception, can be quite a dangerous place for queer people. I might be wrong on that, but I think maybe then if it is, that the language like that is also essential for queer people to be able to, in the same way that we were talking about, sort of being able to go undetected, if that makes sense at all. I don't know what you think about that.
I think that makes sense. And I'm glad that there are things of this where it is still needed. But do you suppose there's anything like that still being used in the West or within the UK?
So Polari sort of lost popularity in sort of like the 70s, and after what I was talking about with the Around the Horn, it sort of didn't have much, and there's actually quite a limited research on Polari. This one's quite a good book if you are interested in Polari, by Paul Baker. I think it's quite a hard book to get hold of, but I think you can get it. You can usually get it in the libraries. This is the library book. But yeah, that sort of talks about how there wasn't a lot of research, and a lot of it goes back to even like the 16th century, a lot of references, but it wasn't really documented until like the late sort of 20th century, the early 20th century, late 18th century, 19th, sorry.
So does the disappearance of it mean that we are now in a society where it is no longer needed? And it is something that will always arise in comparison to how much necessity there is?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think because, like we said, it's no longer, this was essential to be used by gay men and lesbian women and queer people at the time when homosexuality was not accepted and illegal even, whereas like now it is not illegal, this sort of protection. Maybe it drops off when the necessity disappears, or not disappears because it's still there, but like I said, it's no longer a criminal offense to be gay now.
Hooray!
Yeah, I think that one of the other themes that it brought up for me, and maybe that other people are wishing to sort of bring in, I think as a last point, is that of what we deem to be the degenerate in the modern sphere. I think for me, the parallels that I've found that can be drawn with regards to degenerate art and views of the degenerate is it's perfectly fine for a cisgender white male to upload an image of themselves pretty much naked on Instagram, but a queer person or a person of color or a female doing similar, their images are immediately blocked by Instagram because it violates some kind of regulation. And I think that there is this idea that the algorithm is sort of skewed a certain way. And I think that there is this idea that the degenerate and the ideas of decency still pervades. And I think that it's, again, just down to this idea that the degenerate, or the words by which degenerate live, have shifted from being an ideology to a computer that's been programmed a certain way due to sort of conscientious bias. It deems the sort of white male to be the ideal with regards to what it thinks is the idealized form to see on a screen. And I think that there's a real danger that unless we, I say we as queer people, I do not wish to speak for everyone here, but certainly myself as a queer person, unless we push back, we are entering down a dangerous road of history repeating itself. What do other people think? Just as a last discussion point.
Or if anybody has any questions about any of the points throughout the whole thing, that we've sort of skipped through it all.
So yeah, does anybody have anything that they'd like to discuss openly, or drop anything in the chat? Some points that they'd like to sort of open up? I appreciate that there's been quite a lot of points raised here.
Yeah, there's quite a lot to go over.
But yeah, if there's anything that you'd like sort of clarification on, or something that you'd like to return back to, now is the time to open things up. This is sort of the last section, so by all means, let rip.
Hiya, can you hear me? Is that working?
Hi, George.
Hi, George.
I just want to say, because you were talking about whether there's like a modern Polari, and I was just thinking that I feel like there is still maybe not necessarily a universal, in inverted commas, gay language, but that there is still very much a place for like slang within local queer communities that is still from a place of safety, I think. And that there is still a need to adapt the way that we speak to meet with our environments. That's kind of like a constant, like, I suppose, sort of like a reflex to perceived danger that I think is still a thing, but maybe is not, maybe doesn't have a name as an action, I suppose.
Maybe, I don't know if would you agree, sort of this idea what Steve was saying about chord switching, and as queer people sort of altering who you are or who you're presenting depending on the situation or the scenario or the place that you are, because I find that I do that often to some degree. If you know that you're with a certain group of like straight men for something, I feel like I would alter potentially something. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can think of an example, but I think that definitely there are words and phrases that and even maybe an exchanging of looks that queer communities still both have to use, and also as like a new form of culture and language, I suppose, that comes from the way things are now. As you said about Instagram, I thought that was a really valid point about like an image culture instead of a like a verbal culture. Yeah.
But so is what you were sort of talking about, is it to do more with language rather than how you present?
I'm not quite sure. I think originally I thought language, but
and I think, like you were saying, the first point you were sort of saying was about how it filters down, the sort of the filtering down of this language into culture, and it does exist, not with the same necessity, but a lot of, even if people who don't really know what Polari is will be watching RuPaul's Drag Race, like a show that is in the mainstream, and don't sort of realize where this language comes from, but actually it does come from, so it sort of has dripped down into sort of society, into the wider society, if you'd agree with that.
Yeah, I definitely would. I mean, some of the words are so ingrained in actually just pop culture now, not even like queer culture, but just overall pop culture, that the original necessity, and if you sometimes I've tried to actually explain about Polari and it as a safety thing, and it's just blows people's minds that you'd have to even use such a language now. But
yeah, I think a lot of people are surprised by the fact you'd have to do something. Well, I suppose that it's more so for people who are straight and have certain privilege, but I think a lot of people are surprised by the fact of how people have to alter their lives, even in the present day, because of certain scenarios.
Yeah, we've just got a few discussions in the chat. So Courtney's asked, do you think altering how you project yourself is a queer thing? I think a lot of people adapt to their surroundings.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was saying about
Yeah.
George's. But yeah, do you want to say something, Steve?
Again, I think that it's similar to what you said. It's and admittedly, I think that it's actually been answered in the chat. It's just loaded. The loading of that has just come through. I think it's been answered in the chat by Garth. But yeah, it's just a lot of the idea that I think that we all everybody code switches to a certain extent. It's just a fact of where we exist. The flip side of that is that I don't think that we should need to. I think that code switching is a fact of life. It's something that I wish wasn't a fact of life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, actually, I think it's not just a queer thing. I think a lot of people do alter how they behave.
Yeah.
And I think another example away from queerness actually is related to the arts and somewhat of like academics as well. But I find that being a northerner and sometimes sounding quite common, and I've talked about this with a friend who works within academia or is doing their PhD, but there's often a bias about sort of northern people, and I find that when I'm in certain situations speaking to certain people within the art world or within sort of have these platforms, I often, and I like can't help it, but I listen to my own voice, I listen to what I'm saying, and I believe what I say about certain things has merit, and I believe in what I do say, but sometimes I feel like I have to alter, it feels like I have something to prove sometimes, and it's like I'm trying to alter my perception of myself, and maybe I'm trying to soften my accent, which I'm probably doing now if I were to talk, as opposed to me talking to my friends and my family. So I do think code switching does a sort of altering how you project yourself, and this is just my experience, and obviously it will exist differently to other people.
But yeah, conversely, I've found the opposite. I've found that in sort of art spaces that have been in the north, because people have found that my accent isn't stereotypically northern. People have asked me, oh, are you from London? Are you from the south? That I've gone, no, I'm born in Sheffield or just outside, and it's just the fact that I don't really know what my accent is. I was born in Sheffield, moved down to South Wales at the age of 5, and then moved back up at the age of 10. So my accent hasn't really had time to stick because of the fact that I've been moving around. So, and I used to get teased at school for being posh just because I didn't actually sound like, I didn't sound Welsh when I lived in Wales, and I didn't sound northern when I moved back up north. So it's sort of this, my accent's just sort of become this homogenized thing that I live with, which I wouldn't change at all, but it's just sometimes it has this sort of strange mutability. It's not north enough and it's not south enough.
Garth, I see polarity as a socialist rather than language, therefore it's appropriation, assimilation, or use of different geographically. Slap, naff, for example. Yeah, I've noticed that a lot of things, words like naff, which I've used sort of in my upbringing, actually looking through like the encyclopedia of words, I noticed that a lot of it does even filter out into the mainstream.
Yeah, the idea that it's of reclaiming it, but not reclaiming the words, reclaiming the origin of it.
So what do you mean in terms of socialist rather than language?
I go on to say that was a typo and I meant to say socialect. I'm not.
Sorry, I hadn't read ahead. Yeah. Yeah, do you wanna talk a little bit more about that, or sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot at all.
As Polari would say, oh, she's put me on the spot. Yeah, I think just from collaborating with artists like Jez Dolan, even he might refer to it as a socialect as opposed to a language in terms of how it's, you know, archived, presented, preserved. You know, it is something that evolves and is evolving as opposed to its clear cut and to be followed like a dictionary in that sense. I mean, there are dictionary examples of Polari just in terms of for people to catch up or get to grips with some of the kind of foundations of a socialect, but I see it as something that's even evolutionary. And I think the comments earlier around Polari perhaps as something that's not needed. I kind of wonder whether 5, 10, 15 years down the line, as we perhaps get to a potentially more fascist environment, that maybe we do need a resurgence in claiming identities and alternative behaviours again, as opposed to assimilating in that way.
Yeah, I think claiming identities is a good sort of point to make.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a good.
And
That's a good point.
I do agree. Like it has been ever changing from, because like I said, some of it dates back to even like as early as the 16th century, but it will have changed and changed meaning and sort of adapted, and maybe even adapted with the time. I don't know if I'm not too sure.
Well, it's not technically a queer socialect, is it? Again, that's something that's been utilised and appropriated again.
Yeah. It was spoken by sort of sailors and potentially even like prostitutes and or sex workers at the time. So it was used by a lot of people, but I think, like you said, it was taken on board by queer people sort of as a means to be able to communicate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, like you said, round the horn, in terms of people that haven't heard of it, Kenneth Williams, just as an actor, and Carry On movies, if anyone knows those in British culture, they're perfect examples of Polari and camp and tongue-in-cheek, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
It's interesting how find it interesting how that was presented on a mainstream platform, and how they sort of angled it to that it was completely understandable. People knew what they were saying, but it was able to go under the sort of the censorship.
But yeah, I think this has all been wonderful, and I've really enjoyed the conversations that we've been having. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. And yes, the things that we've been discussing and the learning that we've used in order to inform our arguments will be able to share with people at the end. Another thing to let people know is that the recording will be made available on my YouTube channel as soon as possible. I'll hopefully be able to make that available on Saturday, and it will also be made available on my website shortly after. This has been great. Thank you ever so much for giving your time to us this evening. I shall be taking a short sabbatical, so there won't be a Zwischen next month. I shall be heading on a staycation because of the relaxation in restrictions. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining us this evening, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much, and enjoy.
Thank you.